Walker, thank you for those nice remarks. And Stan, also, thank you so much. Um, it's kind of scary. They actually talk about U.S. policy. And I kind of shied a little bit and started shaking a little bit. I can't, I implement, I don't set policy. So let me put that on record from the very beginning. I'm a technician. But anyway, I'm supposed to be talking about, I think, U.S. policy towards improving education outcomes in Africa. Now, I ask you the question, and I want you to think about this. What is the root cause of inferior educational outcomes? What would be your response? Think about it. Because when we start talking, now Sarah's response would be poverty. I want to hear about your response. Those outcomes, in turn, play a major role in determining the future extent and incidence of poverty, those things that happen. We must begin to identify the policies needed to ensure that educational outcomes properly benefit the disadvantaged. We talk about Africa, we talk about disadvantaged, but are we providing the educational tools that will benefit the disadvantaged? It is clear that a simple expansion of education systems does not always benefit the poor, particularly where the quality of education is very low. Africa has witnessed a degradation of learning outcomes over the past decade. Teachers and their performance in the classroom is one of the most critical factors in improving students' learning. And we talk about that a lot, but what are we doing about it? In rural African schools, there are generally I added to this 4 main challenges, I would say. One, I've mentioned poverty. The second, instability. Third, a lack of what? Qualified teaching staff. And the fourth one that I usually add to the list that people talk about is a lack of materials, resource materials, books. How many of us go and there are just no books in the schools? The area in which change is most difficult, but also most decisive, is in the daily interactions between teachers and students. This is why the kind of reform most likely to succeed will begin where? In the classroom. The content and the methods recommended by the curricula must make good use of all cultural experiences which encourage learning. Think about the books that we see in the schools. Do they encourage learning? Are they culturally sensitive? Sending books from a publishing company to Somalia that talk about pigs, is that culturally sensitive? They must be culturally sensitive. There are very critical shortages of what in Africa? Teachers. Critical shortages. We need to focus on improving learning outcomes in conjunction with interesting or increasing access. We must also promote synergies between the education sector and other development sectors. I'm glad to see some people going to new countries that are in the audience today. We can't just talk about just education by itself, because then we're isolating education. What about the health side? What about agriculture? What about economic development? Because we also know that children are going to school what? with empty stomachs, hungry. So do we not need to try to provide some feeding for these children? USAID has planned to focus on one, potential dropouts and marginalized children, especially girls. 2, children who've recently dropped out, and we can kind of catch them before they get used to being out on the street and return them to school. And 3rd, youth who've dropped out and require additional skills to join the economy. Vocational schools. You've talked a lot about that, Charlie. In our bilateral programs at USAID, we will begin focusing on foundational learning skills, those skills that we need to begin the journey into lifelong learning. Lifelong learning. New cost-effective ways of measuring mid-primary cycle to ensure that what children are learning is what is necessary to survive. We need to have appropriate assessment tools to evaluate these foundations. We are also looking at how to address the critical growing youth populations in Africa. By the way, estimates are that youth under 20 years old will make up, guess what? What percentage? Can anybody guess? 50% of the population of most countries by 2050. Youth. Are we preparing these young people to become what? The leaders. So we need to be focusing on that, and that's one of the things that through the U.S. government education program that we are. But we must keep in mind, as we focus in on these youth, that the focus must be cross-sectoral. It cannot be just education. We must look at the orphans and deal with the health issues. We must look at agriculture. When I first started this 100 years ago, in the schools in Africa, you had agriculture programs. You had, well, they call it domestic science. Back in the day, as my daughter would say, they call it home economics when I was in school. We got to go back to that now. We're having food issues in Africa. We need to get back to the agriculture. So education, agriculture, nutrition, health, economic development, we've got to be comprehensive as we plan and develop these programs. And one last comment I want to make, and to show me I got to toot the horn a little bit. We have gone the route of primary education, basic education. We're going to keep going that route. We're not going to quit it. But we've got to look at higher education, folks. We've got to. Because then we do the full complement. The full complement. And I'm not going to burst anybody's bubble, but thank goodness for Don Payne, our congressman. Higher education is on the agenda for the U.S. Congress. Higher education where? In Africa is on the agenda for our Congress. So I'm going to stop there because I like to answer questions, but one little advertisement, I want everybody to get this book. Please look at it, because when we talk about youth, this is one of the very few, if not the only one, organization that has put together such a document, put together by youth, about youth, and what you can do with youth, and being instituted and implemented also in the Casamance of Senegal. Thank you very much.